Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies. This is a YouTube video podcast where we explore all things cinema. I want to welcome back to the show Mike White, who is the host of the fantastic podcast, the Projection Booth Podcast. Mike, welcome back.
Robert, it is great being here. Thank you so much for having me back on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, anytime, anytime. It's I know I've been on your show a few times in the last year, but I think it's been a little while since you've been on mine. So it's great to finally find something we can do. And we are discussing Flesh. So for people who perhaps haven't seen it, I'll just read a little synopsis. Or if you haven't seen it in a while, a man desperate for money and no income turns prostitute. I shouldn't say turns, is a prostitute, and interplays with a variety of clients and hustlers. Directed by Paul Morrissey. He also wrote the screenplay and it starred a lot of the Warhol superstars of the day: Joe Dallesandro, Geraldine Smith, Patti D'Arbanville. We also have Candy Darling, Jackie Curtis, Maurice Bradell. And as I mentioned, they're the Warhol superstars because Andy Warhol was the producer of this film, but Paul Morrissey was the director. All right. So I know you didn't care for this one, Mike. This was a first viewing for me as well. So I imagine this was a first viewing for you. You hadn't seen it
It
before?
was, yeah. No, had I seen it, I probably would have said, yeah, let's go with something else. But yeah, these the Morrissey slash Warhol films are a little difficult for me sometimes. I have seen some that I've liked. I really liked Blood for Dracula and Flesh for
Ah,
Frankenstein.
right, right.
I think I seem to remember enjoying parts of, was it Trash? One
Yeah,
with
Trash is the one right after this.
yeah, it's where is that the one with oh, why am I blanking on the actress's name where she throws a baby out the window?
Is
Um
that the woman who was in Midnight Cowboy? I forget her
uh
name. Who's she's
n-
in Heat?
oh no, I'm thinking of God, why am I blanking on her name? She was the queen in um Susan Tyrell. There we go. Jeez. Uh
Oh, yes, 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 yes.
yeah, where there's a baby just crying, crying, crying. She picks up the baby and throws it out the window. That's
Oh
probably my
God,
favorite bit.
which one was that? Do you remember?
I thought it was Trash, but maybe it was Heat or
Okay,
something. I don't know. So
yeah, because I
one,
I just saw Trash recently, and I go,
oh, okay,
maybe it was a different. I haven't seen Heat yet. That because it's just like a loose trilogy.
right.
But yes, Flesh. So what was it about it that you didn't like? I'm curious.
Well, I'm all about like amateur type productions and stuff, and I really feel that this film and films like it probably were an inspiration to people like John Waters, where it's like, okay, I've got this small group of actors. We don't
Yeah.
have a lot of money. We're just gonna, do our best to make a film. But there's just something sloppy about this movie. I think it was the whole thing with the jump cuts that they were doing, and they're bringing extra attention to it because the audio was clicking every single time there was a jump cut as well,
Yeah.
because it was a sync sound camera. So that, I mean, at least
Yeah,
that,
I've got it
like,
here on Wikipedia that the Morrissey often included the camera's flash frames and pops, which
yes.
occur when starting and stopping the camera as an aesthetic choice. Yeah.
Oof. I wouldn't have gone with that choice.
Yeah.
And then you get those long scenes of just kind of rambling dialogue where it just feels like, they're improving, but they don't have a whole lot of stuff to say. There are a couple scenes in here where I'm like, okay, this is all right. Like the scene with the where he's doing poses and stuff for the artist, I guess is
Oh,
the
yeah.
character's name. But
Yeah.
then there are others like where it's the two women reading the magazines and talking at each other. And I'm just like, can we get people with less annoying voices? And especially at the end when it's the two women and Joe and they're just
Oh, right.
talking like crazy. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to kill myself if I have to listen to this woman any more than this. It was one of those where I'm just, pausing it constantly, looking at the time code, going, okay, 20 more minutes. All right, feel myself for this. So, yeah, it didn't hit my sweet spot. What did you think about this one?
I wasn't sure what to expect, and I watched it a couple of times. I watched it about a few weeks ago because I thought let me let it breathe for a little bit in my mind after watching it. And I watched it again, and I must say I did really enjoy it. There's
Oh, good.
something so there's something very engaging, and I mean, it might sound strange, but to me, just so watchable because of these misfits and these outsiders and these people who live on the fringes who you get, what I like of so much about the film is that the filmmakers are not trying to tell you why they behave this way or about their backstory. It's really sort of a film that doesn't tell you how to feel, how to think. It doesn't have like a message or a clear point of view. It just feels like they are capturing these people's lives, and you can sort of make up your own mind because we don't know why Joe turned to prostitution. We don't know. I mean, another thing is a lot of the times the characters talk about being bored. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, why are they so bored in their life? Um, and we don't really know a lot of these things. And I think ultimately it forces you to just look at the way the characters are interacting and sort of take whatever that is for you. And so I found a lot of the interactions with the various quote unquote Johns, because as I said, as he went out to find, he's raising $200 for an abortion for his wife's girlfriend, and so he's trying to raise this money throughout the day to bring home. Um, I found all the various interactions he had quite interesting. I mean, the fact he's got these like new hustlers that he's like training, and he's giving them like all this advice about how to be a hustler. And then all these people are very sweet with him, which I thought that's so unusual with like a
Mm-hmm.
movie about. I mean, we've seen so many about female prostitution, but outside of American Gigolo and my own Private Idaho, I can't think of a lot of like a male gigolo films. But maybe there's a lot more than I just don't know about. But it was so different for me because I'm like, these guys are like being rather sweet with him. Like this third guy after the artist, for example, he almost looked like he was like in love with him, and it was sort of like, he's talking about the fact that he couldn't even get a hard on. So I'm like, is he
Right.
just here because he likes to hang out with this guy? They were friends from they met at a gym. He seemed to be almost like a macho type. He's like showing off his war wounds. There's just, for me, was just so there's so much to unpack just about the dialogue alone. But if there's any kind of essence to it, or perhaps something that they were after, but I think right in the title, the fact that it's called Flesh is interesting because he really is sort of like a piece of flesh, like a piece of meat that is used as an object for these men to be aroused by. And then even his wife, in the first scene, she like ties a bow around his penis. And then the last scene with her girlfriend, they take all of his clothes off. But then on the flip side, when you see him, it's like it shows like the naked body in different ways. Like when you see him with his son, it's just natural and gentle and warm. And then in another light, the human body is, again, a piece of flesh, just something to be aroused by. So I found those things interesting, but he's not necessarily telling you, or Joe Dallesandro's not behaving in a way where we know, like, oh, does he not like to do this? Does he hate doing it? Does he like doing it? Because so many of the characters have this sort of apathetic, neutral uh behavior, like not very emotional, and they're sort of extremely mellow and laid back. I don't know. I found it pretty compelling. I don't know if any of those things at least popped out to you, or
Mm-hmm.
what you thought.
Yeah, definitely the scene that you were talking about with the guy who's genuinely seems like he's in love with them. I like that a lot. That was probably my favorite bit. And I especially liked when he was just like, well, we're not queer. We're
Yes,
not. And
yes,
I'm like,
yeah.
okay, try to convince yourself of that. That
I
whole like,
suppose that goes back to that. I don't know if men are still like this, but I could just thinking about like a well-known figure was like Roy Cohn, the lawyer who died of AIDS, and even as they portray him in Angels in America, and one of the lines is, "Oh, I'm not gay. I just fuck other men." You know,
Right.
and I've known other like much older gay men who maybe never actually came out, and that sometimes that line of thinking is like, "Oh, I'm not gay. I just fuck guys." You know,
Right.
so
Right.
maybe they're not. I don't know, but I thought that was interesting that was in this film too.
Yeah, I like that guy. I mean, from what I understand, this whole movie was kind of a reaction to Midnight Cowboy
Yeah,
because they were
right.
kind of eating Andy Warhol's lunch by taking some of the superstars and having them in that party scene. So
Yeah,
have just put out an episode on Midnight Cowboy. So watching Flesh, which I
yeah. I
didn't
was just
do for
listening
that
to it.
episode, I should have done that for the episode. So this was homework that I didn't do. So I'm
Ah,
glad that you had me do this because there were a lot of things where I was like, oh, I can kind of see these parallels and
oh yeah,
just see how this goes. I do like the whole thing of him waking up in the morning and then him going to sleep at the end of the movie. But at the same time, like as he's falling asleep, we were just on him for the longest time. And I'm like
yeah.
having flashbacks of I went to see, I can't remember the name of the movie, but it was just called Sleep, the Warhol
Oh, the
film.
Warhol. Yeah.
Oh
8
my
hours
God.
of sleeping.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, that one with Susan Tyrrell is bad. I looked that
Oh,
up.
okay. I don't know that one. Is
Yeah,
that also Morrissey? Is that a
I
Morrissey film?
it's called Andy Warhol's Bad, so I'm
Oh,
guessing that
okay.
it was. No, actually it was directed by Jed Johnson.
Oh,
So
okay. So that's a different
yeah,
collaboration. Okay.
yeah, apologies for that. So that was 1977. So
Okay. So
yeah,
after this, okay.
well after this one, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
It's
yeah, I
it's
guess it
sorry.
was
Go ahead.
like the the woman with the breasts, and she just kept talking about getting injected with silicone and stuff. Her voice was the one that really put me over the edge, and then his
Uh,
wife's voice too, with the whole tying up of the penis and everything. And I'm just like, okay, I- I'm all right with it. Obviously, the
yeah.
content doesn't bother me at all. It's the presentation. So it's just like, oh, like it just felt such like a slog. But like the scenes you pointed out when he's talking to the younger guys and telling them how to become hustlers, and that was good. And yeah, that scene really reminded me of My Own Private Idaho, just with that
Yeah.
whole Bob kind of that Falstaff type character and taking people under his wing and everything and having to be the center of it all. I don't know if Joe would ever end up being like that, but just him giving the advice to the younger guys and kind of talking himself up and everything. And I mean, I love Joe Dallesandro. So just watching him and watching him act, and of
Yeah.
course, you get to see such a hunk and everything, especially back then. And
Oh,
the
geez.
camera's
Yeah. He
just
was in
lingering
great
on his
shape.
body. Oh, yeah.
God.
Whew.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've
Yeah.
never been in that shape.
I haven't even been close anywhere
Oh,
near it.
my
I'm still
shape's
trying
always
to.
been round.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because obviously this wasn't scripted, and I was watching an interview with Joe Dallesandro, and he was saying a lot of people just thought that was his life because he
Mm.
is like so convincing as this hustler. And he said
Oh, yeah.
it's not. But what they did was Morrissey basically told them what to talk about, and they just riffed on it. Um, which in not in a bad way, in a good way, you can feel because of the looseness and the roughness of it. And again, and I know what you mean. So, some of the, I mean, if I were gonna do it, I wouldn't have included hearing the pop
Yeah.
noises. I would have said maybe let's trim it. It's rough enough. But because, like I said, it worked for me because of this are people on the margins, and it's such a rough story in a lot of ways that I think it lent itself quite well to take this sort of like really low budget approach to it. But what I also found compelling was that it wasn't he was a hustler, but the again we didn't, and in a good way, he because he doesn't show a lot of emotion about how he feels about these things. The only time I got more of a sense was when he was training those like young hustlers, and I was like, he almost seemed to be like almost proud of it. Like he's
Hmm.
like, oh, what's wrong with it? I feeds my wife, and what's the problem? And I can make this much money at it if I do it every day. And he's giving them advice, and I imagine that's such a late '60s thing, sexual revolution. We have much more sexual experimentation and people starting to sort of look at these things in different ways. And, I mean, to me, it's almost showing that, hey, these things are no big deal. He's just earning his living this way, just like anybody else does in their own variety of ways. I don't know if that was your impression.
Yeah, to your point, as far as it being kind of the snapshot of the late 60s with the sexual revolution, everything, just when they're going back and forth and reading the magazines, I was
Oh, right.
fascinated by that stuff because I'm like, oh, I want to hear what the news of the day in 1968 was. Like, read those stories to me. I want to hear those stories. And so when they would read bits of the magazines, I'm like, oh, this is very fascinating. But it was more like as a time capsule kind of thing rather than here's two people reading magazines and then here's a guy getting a blowjob over here. And again, it's like, okay, and at one point I think they say, like, are you not going to pay attention to us? And I was like,
Right, right, right.
yeah, that's a good question. I don't know what's going on because we never see the beginnings and endings of scenes. We just kind of are always
It just
dropped
starts
right
in
in
the
the
middle.
middle. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's like we
yeah.
don't see him getting picked up by a lot. Well, like we see him get picked up by the older guy. But
Yeah.
for the most part, it's just like, okay, here we are. Boom, we're right in the middle of a scene. It's like, okay, it's an
Mhm.
interesting way of telling stories. It's just, there are times where I'm like, oh, I'd like to know more about this. Like, how did this happen? What's going to happen later? And yeah, this whole idea of it just being a day in his life. And at the same time, I'm just like, did I ever have the recovery time that this guy has? Like he's coming at least 3 or 4 times during the day. I'm like, how does that work?
That's how you know he's a good hustler.
Yeah, got to get his hands on some vitamin E.
I think it suggested that he saw more than just those three people
Yeah,
because he only really sort of. Oh, well, actually, no, yeah, you're right. Because he's with the one woman who's going down on him, the first guy in the washroom, where we just see them saying goodbye. But then with the artist, there wasn't any sex, and with the guy from the
right.
gym, there wasn't either. So I guess he had a bit of a break to sort of
Yeah.
reset.
And it is neat to see everybody's kinks and stuff. Like if you did
Yeah,
have the money to hire Joe Dallesandro, what are you doing with him? And that they each have their own agenda with this guy, where it's like,
yeah,
the artist guy, where he's just like, oh, we'll do this, and just wants to
right.
see him in the poses. Kind of reminded me, to your point with My Own Private Idaho, of the guy who wanted his apartment cleaned and just had River Phoenix cleaning his apartment. He's just like getting so off on watching River Phoenix clean his
Yeah,
apartment. I'm like,
yeah.
okay, yeah. I mean, different strokes for different folks.
Right. Or even like Belle de Jour has those guys with those really weird kinks
Oh
and
yeah, the funeral guy, the guy who wants
mm,
her to just lay in the coffin and
oh
he's
my
underneath
God.
her. Holy cow! Yeah,
Yeah. No, I've seen that in other, movies about prostitutes, like horror with Teresa Russell,
right.
Kent Russell. There's scenes like that. But this to me, that's he did it in a way which was, or I should say, they did it in a way which was different because I kept thinking about the artist. I'm like, is this some kind of a kink of his? But then he seemed to like take it so seriously in terms of like telling him about the history of like Greek sculptures
Oh yeah,
and modeling. And he's so respectful and he doesn't ever seem to be aroused or anything. And he's like drawing him, he's taking pictures. And he is in this art world. So maybe for him, it was sort of like, oh no, it's kind of like, it's like those people who they go and pose naked for the artist to draw them. And it's like,
right.
oh, I mean, I think he was looking at it that way, but it could certainly be interpreted that this was a kink. Maybe he just wasn't showing.
Exactly. Yeah. Who knows what happens after Joe leaves?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I laughed the second. I found more of the humor the second time. Like he keeps talking about art, and then suddenly Joe goes, "Yeah, when's dinner?" And even he laughed. The actor. Actually, I looked him up. He actually was an actor in the 20s and 30s,
Oh wow.
and he was Noel Coward's understudy in Private
Huh.
Lives, one of his famous plays there.
Oh
And then
wow.
he went to America and was working in the art world. So
Hmm.
I mean, I guess they just knew him. They must, Warhol must have just,
Oh yeah. That circle is probably pretty tight
yeah.
there.
Like I
Yeah.
was wondering, I'm like, where did they get this guy?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, just seeing New York in that in 1968 was great. I always enjoy
Oh
seeing,
yeah.
that again, that time capsule where I'm just like, oh, okay. And just to hear again some of the news stories and just to see the fashions, all of that was fascinating for me. But it was just like some of the scenes just drove me a little nuts. So, and it didn't
Oh, I
help that
can.
it
Yeah,
started off with that
yeah.
the first scene was tough. So I actually watched the first bit. I can't remember if I made it to the second part, but I turned it off for a couple days and I came back to it. And then I was like, oh, okay. And then when I was watching it again, it moved a lot better. And then once we got towards the end with that woman who was just obsessed about the size of her breast, once that started, I was just like, okay, this is tough. But like the middle part, I was really happy with the middle.
Well, that was another really interesting moment, and that was another thing about like sex in the film just seemed like so normal to just do it anywhere or to do it with someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's married, but he's with this woman, and that didn't seem to be a transactional,
Yeah.
endeavor. It seemed to just like happen. We don't know, like for sure, but it seemed to just be happening. And you're right. I didn't pick up on the fact because they're off camera when they say, "Hey, what do you guys? Aren't you going to pay attention to us?"
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Jackie and Candy there, but before you know it, they're sort of like, meh, okay, and then they're just as they keep like making out, and they're like, and she's lying on top of him, and you see Jackie just sort of looks over, and it's all just so normal, it's all
Mm-hmm.
like it is what it is, and it's no big deal. And again, here we are like a decade before AIDS, and these were the things that were, again, late 60s happening, where people were sort of experimenting with sex. And another thing that I found interesting is that no one necessarily identifies as straight or gay, like we sort of touched on. Like the last John, the guy from the gym, saying that he's not queer, and then even Joe says to the hustlers, "Oh, what's straight? Who's straight?"
Right.
And his wife has a girlfriend. These things, whether they're just experimental or these people are bi, it just seems like labels just don't matter. It's like
Right.
you just go to whatever you're attracted to. I don't know. Was that your impression about that aspect of it?
Yeah, it was. And I was curious, like, how normal was that? I mean, is that just a New York thing? Is it just within this circle of Warhol? Is this just a filmic thing? Like, is this really how the world was? Probably was for
Yeah,
some people,
for
but
some, I suppose. The people on the
yeah,
margins.
exactly. But
Yeah.
yeah, to your point, like the whole idea of looking at these people on the margins, like there's no mention made at all about is it Jackie is she the trans person?
Yeah, the one
Yeah,
with
it's like
the brown hair, the short
yeah,
hair.
yeah. And there's no like, oh, isn't this weird? This person is
Yeah,
not like the rest of us. It's like, no, it's just she's here. She's doing what she needs to do. So
yeah.
I think that was great.
And even that story she tells about, she talks about getting raped, and it's this horrible story. And then she
Oh,
starts laughing, and she's like, "Well, when I look back, it's kind of fun. It was kind of fun." And then I thought, well, maybe that's she's just trying to normalize the
right.
trauma for herself. But I can't help. I wonder if they said, "Hey, maybe mentions make up something about rape," or maybe she actually was raped, and he was like, "Tell
Right.
that story." Who knows? But that was like, wow, gee, even if I heard that now in a movie, that would be pretty
Yeah.
daunting.
Yeah, and that really the other rape story where the woman was talking about like, oh, I got raped, and then I was topless in front of this guy, and he was
Oh
my
yeah, yeah.
rapist, and I'm just like, okay, like you are one of the worst actresses I've ever seen in a movie.
Because
So,
she was happy, you mean, when she was
well,
saying it?
she was just the way that she talked. I was just like, oh my god, this is so stilted. Like it just I was like, oh, like maybe this really happened to you, but just the way that you're telling the story just didn't land with me at all. And just like her whole, like, it really felt like she was trying to act. There were other people who felt like they were just there being filmed. Like the guy who said he's not queer, like he seemed the most naturalistic of all the people in the movie. Just like put a camera on this guy and let him go, and he goes. And other people have felt like I'm really trying to act in front of the camera. And it's like, please stop. Like just don't do that. I'd rather have verite than you really like putting on and trying to become like, a superstar, no pun intended.
Yeah, I saw some other reviews because Ebert said something similar as well. I was reading his review, and I don't know. For me, I didn't find that. I found everybody to be quite. I thought it was pretty impressive how they got these non-actors to be pretty comfortable on screen. I know what you mean because she was so sort of laissez-faire about it and sort of like
Mm-hmm.
hipper, but I took that as the fact that she was trying to make it seem like it was, oh, in hindsight it was a funny
Mm-hmm.
thing. But yeah, I think you know having some, even if she had some pain there, it would have
Mm-hmm.
been interesting if she was trying to cover it up or something. But I don't, I know what you mean, but I found for the most part people fairly comfortable. What did you think of the two, Jackie and Candy? They're two, what they used to call transvestites. It even says that here on IMDb, transgender
Mm-hmm.
now. Did you think that they were also sort of trying to perform, or what did you think
Not
of them?
really, no. I felt a little bit like they were, but not too much.
Right.
Again, it felt like Morrissey or somebody gave them stage direction. You're going to read these articles, you're going to talk to each other, or you're going to go back and
Classic
forth.
Hollywood
Yeah,
magazine. Yeah, yeah,
exactly. And I was just like, okay, I can kind of see. So it felt like every once in a while they're like, oh, they ran out of material. Like, so they would try something else. And it's like, okay. So it just like felt a little rougher on the edges, but like their performances I thought were okay. But I think, you know, the guy who I mentioned and then Joe, I think Joe probably pulled it off the most. And I've seen him in other things. I've
yeah. He's
seen him,
impressive.
yeah, yeah. And I think that he's probably like the closest to a real actor that they had in their stable.
Well, he went on to have like a pretty solid career in Europe.
Oh yeah.
Um, and
Yeah,
this is
his
certainly
work
one
in
of those
Lamarche is
films.
great.
Yes, and this is one of those films where that old saying of like, well, they hated it in America, but they loved it in Europe. Or loved it in Europe or loved it in Paris? One or the other.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if they loved. Apparently, it was a big hit in Germany.
Hmm.
Uh, I read, but there is that bit of trivia. Yeah, just reading it here when they they played it in London, and the cops came in and kicked everybody out because they released it without a rating
Mm.
at the time. And so yeah, it just says here. Following a complaint by a member of the public, authorities raided the open space theater because the film did not possess a British Board of Film Classification
Mm.
certificate. So after that, they gave it an X.
Hmm. Yeah, I did feel a little voyeuristic at times. Just when the girl's taking off her top to show her breasts, or when Joe's stripping down towards the end, I was just like,
Yeah.
I did notice like I would kind of perk up and be like, oh, are they actually going to show stuff? Oh, yep, they are. They're going to show the whole kielbasa here.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, okay, this was probably pretty radical when it came
Oh
out
yeah.
because it's
Oh God.
before
Yeah.
porn. They're not having sex, but it's somewhere between like softcore and hardcore with the way that they're
Yeah.
portraying this. I was like, oh, okay, I'm very surprised here. So yeah, I can see why it was so controversial.
Oh God. Yeah. Yeah. Because I think even now, I mean, now we've sort of regressed in some ways in
Oh
around
yeah.
sex on screen. I think people would probably be even more shocked now than then.
Oh, this
Possibly.
the scene with him and his son. It's like, oh my god, there's a naked man on
Mm,
screen with a little kid. It's like,
right.
yeah, he's playing with his son. Okay. Don't get bent out of shape about it, but yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sure it would just be cause quite a furor now.
Oh, I think so. I think so. The last scene it was both funny and sort of it was one of the few times where you saw any kind of perhaps anger come out of Joe because his this girl's girlfriend comes here and then she's like, actually, I'm not gonna have the abortion, and then he's like, well, you see, you should have asked her first. I wouldn't have went out and got all this money, and then when she asked him for the money, he denies that he had it.
Hmm.
I guess because I guess he was mad that because she didn't need it for, I guess, groceries or bills or whatever. And he's like, yeah, no, I don't have it. I'll try again tomorrow.
Hmm.
So I suppose because he was pissed off that he had to go get all that money and then she didn't need this abortion. But what I thought was interesting was the fact that he didn't know this girl, and yet she told him to go do this, and he did it. And even in the end, you see the two women cuddling, and they again, like, not like lovers, and he just looks over at them, and he looked rather jealous to me. And I thought, which is sort of ironic, seeing what he was up to
Right.
earlier in the day. But perhaps that speaks to the complexities of these relationships, like, whether they're open or not, or
Mm-hmm.
um, you can't help but feel something when you see your wife with someone else. And that's when I thought, yeah, I mean, there it is. Like, I don't know if you've seen many of Sean Baker's movies, like Florida Project,
Mm-mm.
uh, where, because he's often interested in like characters who live on the margins, and he shows them in he portrays really just what it might be like, and under different circumstances. And often you kind of forget that they're either porn stars or addicts or borderline homeless or whatever, and you find you can relate to them a lot. And I mean, this film, I think the one aspect of it for me was just like, here's a guy who just like, he seems to actually maybe perhaps love this woman, as a child with her, and he's going out to earn for her, and now there's like this jealousy and this weird love triangle. And I
Right.
thought that was one of the things that I think if anyone could relate to anything here, would be that. Was that, I don't know if that was your, I just from the way he looked, and they really
Mm-hmm.
lingered on that expression. I thought he looks jealous to me. I don't know how you felt.
Yeah, totally. And I was like, well, is this going to turn into another sex scene or not? But I was kind of glad it didn't. But then, yeah, I did see that emotion on his face, and I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this guy's really got, some deeper thoughts going on here. And
Yeah, I
yeah,
think so.
again, to your point, to just be so open about abortion, again,
Yes, yes, yeah.
even
68.
in 2024, that would
Oh
be,
God, yeah.
illegal in several states now. So,
Yeah.
oof.
Yeah, yeah. That's what I always find so interesting about, when you look at something older, because, you know, I think sometimes people who maybe don't know much about older films, they have this feeling that, like, oh, well, if they're older, then maybe they're dated in some ways, and that might be true of some. But then you look at something like this, and it's like, it makes today look dated,
Right, right.
which I find so fascinating about history, that it's not just steps forward. It's like a roller coaster. It just, things politically change and people change, and nothing's just
Oh
linear.
yeah. Well, it used to be, people could light up a joint in a movie and it would be absolutely fine. And then in the 80s, it was just like, oh my God, you're smoking
Right,
pot. You
exactly.
are a villain. It's like,
Yeah,
okay, why wasn't in
right,
78, this was fine. In 82, I'm a villain. So,
right. Yeah, that push much more to the right in the 80s, and this, of course, is luckily a decade ahead of that. But I know we touched a little bit on this aspect of like characters talking about like boredom, because even the young women at the end are like, I'm so bored, and they talk about like everything's always the same day in and day out. And he's like, as soon as he gets home, he falls asleep pretty quickly. I mean, then again, that was a pretty big day. I mean, I
oh
think I
yeah.
probably the fact that she was criticizing him, she was like, he's lazy. I'm like, you know what he was doing all day? Then again, I think he made them think that he didn't do anything. So I could see maybe why they say that. But there is this element of like bored. And I kept thinking, what is that about this? And apparently Candy Darling, who was one of the transgender actors who we saw in that scene with the classic Hollywood magazine, she died in 74, and on her deathbed she wrote a letter to the Warhol and the Warhol crew and everybody in the factory, and she wrote that she really is so bored of life, and she
Hmm.
put bored to death. I guess
Wow.
perhaps she was joking there. So this element of boredom, and I even Googled it, like Andy Warhol were the Warhol superstars interested in boredom? And there are some articles that popped up. I mean, even his
Hmm.
film, like these 8-hour takes of someone sleeping.
Oh yeah.
And he's like, he seems, even Warhol himself, and everybody in this film, not everybody, but a lot of them have this like vacant sort of zombie-like expression. And I kept thinking, what is that about? Did you have any thoughts on that?
No, I just when I believe in the philosopher Harvey Danger, who once said, "If you're bored, then you're boring." Because like
Uh,
I don't ever have time to be bored. So
right.
I'm very rarely bored, and I don't know if that's just because I make too much work for myself or what it is, but I and maybe it was again a different era type of thing. We didn't have as many things to keep us occupied and distracted as we did in 1968. So maybe that was part of it too. But I'm just like, man, if you're bored, go pick up a book, go to the
Right.
movies. There's tons of stuff to do, and I wish I had all the time in the world. I wish I could be bored, but I don't have that luxury.
Well, I thought because because they a few of them, including Joe, talk about like dropping out of school and like
Mm-hmm.
before even high school. Again, we're seeing people live on the margins, and I would imagine that they come from rough circumstances,
True.
probably let's say left home, thrown out of home. I thought this because of this sort of rejection from society, perhaps, is making them feel like they can't be included or they can't do certain things, and so what makes them
Yeah.
feel like what can I do? And so they don't really know.
Or
They don't really know what to do.
maybe being bored is their way of rejecting society back, I suppose.
Possibly, yeah,
Yeah. I'm not going to participate in your idle
yeah,
entertainments. Yeah.
yeah, possibly. But I found that compelling. Do you know much about like Warhol in general? Are you?
Little bit. I went down to the Warhol Museum actually just last summer and hung out there for a
Hmm.
while, which was good. I more come to Warhol through the Velvet Underground than
Oh, right, yeah,
through him himself. I This might be controversial, but I've always said like if Andy Warhol can do all these things and get famous, then it should be no problem for me because I always just felt like, it was just so strange, like the repetition of images and things that he
yes,
would do
yes,
and the silk screening, because it just felt like he was kind of ripping off the world, like to do
yeah,
paintings of soup cans and stuff. I'm just like, that got you famous? Like, well, what
yeah,
what what would happen if you had like real talent and you were actually making original things? But I know that was his brand, his stock, and everything.
yeah.
So it's like, all right, that's cool that you back. Somebody's got to do it. But I'm just shocked that he made such a splash with doing what he did.
I have to dive deeper in. I've sort of dabbled on reading about him, and I've seen some documentaries. So I'd have to dive a little deeper into share more of an opinion. But one thing a couple of things about Paul Morrissey that I read was it's hard to believe a guy, apparently he's extremely right wing. And it's hard to
Yeah,
believe that a guy who was that right wing would make this. It's like, wow. Because I mean, then again, maybe the right wing of the 60s was not maybe what it is now.
right, right. Yeah.
Whereas
I
now
don't
they're like,
know.
everything's about anti-trans,
Hmm.
they're against anti-abortion, and these movies like seem to be like, pro, the complete opposite, pro-trans. Here's a guy looking for money for an abortion. It
Hmm.
seems to not put down prostitutes. So it's pretty. It's pretty. What an interesting contradiction.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I don't know if he was always right wing or if that just, like it's an old person
Yeah.
syndrome type of thing where it's like you start to reject all the stuff that you were when you're young, and a lot of that includes politics. They have that whole thing like, "Oh, well, you're liberal because you're young." And it's like, "No, baby, I'm 52. I'm still as
Yeah.
left wing as they come." So, yeah.
Yeah.
But I do
Exactly.
have to recommend, like you're talking about getting more into Warhol. I know you're up in Toronto, but if you ever come down to Pennsylvania, his museum is in Pittsburgh, and it's a great museum.
Oh, okay. Great.
Yeah,
I'll have to check
it's
that out. Have you
it's really
seen
nice.
the two films after this? Trash. Oh, we touched on it, but you did see them or no?
I did
Trash.
not see
The
them
other one,
now.
Heat. Okay. I didn't see Heat yet, but I saw Trash. I actually like Trash more than this
Oh,
one.
good.
Um, not a lot more. I liked it a little bit more. That one has more of a there's more dramatic scenes and more
Hmm.
conflict, and also you feel like there's more of a sort of a point of view, like Was saying that he was trying to like make an anti-drug film with trash.
Mm.
So that yeah, it has some other elements to it, but and Heat I have not seen yet, but I hear it's like a spoof on Sunset Boulevard, which is
Oh,
interesting.
interesting. All right.
And of course it has I always forget her name, the woman who was in of course Midnight Cowboy that you just reviewed,
Oh, Sylvia
Sylvia
Miles.
Miles.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it says here parody of Sunset Boulevard, so
See, and
I'll
I've
have to
talked
watch.
about Sunset Boulevard on the show too, and I should have watched this. So
Ah,
shame on me.
do you ever re-review movies that you've done before? Yeah, you have with Eyes Wide Shut. I noticed you did a couple of times.
Yeah, and then we just did a full re-review of Taking what Pelham 123.
Oh, okay,
Yeah. Yeah, I felt
fantastic.
like I kind of gave that one short shrift because we only had like I think we talked for like a half an hour about it, and that
Oh, wow,
included
okay.
the two remakes. And it's like, how did we talk about this movie in half an hour? So it's like, yeah,
Oh,
I wanted to give it a little bit more time.
okay. For people who don't are watching this and just hearing about your show, can you talk a little bit about what the Projection Booth podcast is all about?
Yeah, yeah. Well, kind of like your show, we every week we talk about one movie, and some of the side ones, like so talking about uh Trash and Heat, or Heat would have been perfect for talking about Sunset Boulevard. But yeah, we talk about one movie a week and kind of deep dive if we can, get some interviews if we can possibly find folks that were involved with the film, even tangentially. So, like when we talked about There Will Be Blood, we interviewed a guy who wrote about Upton Sinclair, so we could hear more about oil and how that was an inspiration for There Will Be Blood. So
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
been doing it coming up on my 13th anniversary this
Wow.
Saturday. And so
Oh, is it?
yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Fantastic.
So
Long
it
journey.
keeps me busy. I'm never bored.
You know what? I never am either. I'm similar. I give myself too much to do.
Oh yeah, yeah. Got a whole
uh
to-do list just tonight. So
yes,
yeah.
yes, exactly. Was there anything else you wanted to mention about Flesh?
No, other than just thank you so much for having me on to talk about it. It was I was glad to hear your take on it. It definitely made me respect the movie a lot more because I didn't
Oh,
want to just
there we
write
go.
it off. So I appreciate you giving me some new insight on it.
And if people want to follow you on social media, Mike, or check out your podcast, where's the best place for them to go?
Best place is to go to the Projection Booth website, which is projectionboothpodcast.com, or you can look up all the shows that I do over on weirdingwaymedia.com, because I also talk about a lot of 70s detective shows, including Barney Miller and Columbo.
Ah,
And then we also do shows on, well, we were talking about Night Gallery, but now we are talking about Tales from the Dark Side, the horror anthology from the 80s, which is a lot of fun so far. So I'm having a good time with that as well. So
great. Fantastic. Well, I will leave the links in the description box for where you can follow Mike on social media and check out his terrific podcast, which I highly recommend. I listen to it often. So check it out there. And Mike, thanks again for coming on.
Robert, thank you so much for having me. I also appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link, patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. Patreon is exclusive content that I create month in and month out. And as a subscriber, you are able to vote on polls and contribute to what I do on Patreon month in and month out. So head over to the link for full details. You can also leave a donation directly to my YouTube channel by pressing the thanks link, which you will find directly below the video frame. Just click on the thanks link and you can leave a donation there if you choose to. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing. It is absolutely free to do so. By pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movies logo, you will see it floating above my head in the top left corner. To your top left in just a second, just click on that and then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new episodes. Also, click the like button and leave a comment below. Let me know what you think of this episode.
Also, you can also share the episode. All of these things are what produce traction to my YouTube channel. So I appreciate you watching, and thank you again, and I will see you in the next episode.